seen a lot of discussion now about the Alabama Supreme Court ruling regarding whether or not embryos created through IVF are considered children. First thing worth noting is that this case was not about abortion laws specifically. It was actually brought by couples using IVF. These couples had all already created embryos through IVF, and their embryos were stored at a fertility clinic, and the long and short of it is that someone who shouldn't have been there wandered in, picked up a bunch of the embryos, dropped them, and killed them. These couples were mourning the loss of their embryos, and they wanted to sue for the wrongful death of their children. Here's the actual Alabama Supreme Court ruling if you want to read it yourself. But the gist of it is actually really straightforward. Alabama has a wrongful death of a minor act, and they have precedent already saying that it applies to children even before birth, and there is nothing in the act that would suggest that that doesn't apply if those embryos or fetuses exist outside of the uterus still alive. The Alabama Supreme Court acknowledges in their ruling that the parties in this case brought up difficult questions about the ethical status of extrauterine children, how the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution plays into it. The defendants also argued that if the Supreme Court decides that even embryos that are not in utero count as children under the Alabama Wrongful Death Act, then that will make IVF much more difficult to do, potentially way more expensive. It could have major public policy implications. The fertility clinics pointed out that the couples suing for wrongful death of minor children didn't really treat their embryos like children and treated them more like property. All of the couples had signed contracts saying things like the fertility clinic could automatically destroy embryos that have remained frozen longer than 5 years. They could donate embryos to medical researchers knowing the projects would result in the destruction of the embryos. They could allow abnormal embryos created through IVF to be experimented on for research purposes and then discarded. The Alabama Supreme Court didn't really resolve any of these complicated issues directly. In fact, what they said was, yes, there's a lot of difficult questions and complicated issues. It's not our job to resolve all of that. Our job is just to look at the Wrongful Death Act and see if it includes embryos both in utero and out. And it says nothing about excluding embryos that are out of utero, so it applies. If you can sue for the wrongful death of your embryo or fetus gestated in utero, then you can sue for the wrongful death of the same when out of utero.